While the concept of creation ex nihilo had been gaining ground for almost 1,000 years, due to its dubious origins, it wasn't until the year 1215 at the Fourth Lateran Council that the Catholic Church promulgated creatio ex nihilo as official church doctrine. In my opinion, this also marks the official beginning of the unquenchable problem of evil plaguing Christian philosophers up to modern times. The secular world views Christianity as a religion that throws common sense and logic out the window. Historically, Christians have indeed made assumptions that were proven false. Consider Galileo Galilei. Here's a quick review. Galileo was an astronomer who taught heliocentrism, the idea that planets revolve around the sun in the solar system. Meanwhile, the Church had turned the assumption of geocentrism into dogma. They insisted that everything revolved around the Earth. This got messy. There was an Inquisition. Galileo was put under house arrest for most of his life. It was very embarrassing later on. Now I posit to you that creation ex nihilo, particularly the creation of our spirits out of nothing, is just another example of the Church making baseless assumptions into doctrine. Now sometimes we put logic and science in one box and then faith and religion in another, hoping to keep them separate. There's actually a degree of validity to this, because we can't just throw away our faith and religion every time there's some kind of scientific discovery. There's also assumptions that are made in science that end up being proven false. But at some point, I believe we have to bring these together. So let's set up this problem of evil. Stephen Parrish once said, "No theology should be countenanced as possibly true, much less considered true, if it cannot account for what we know about the world we live in." Now, this is the very same kind of reasoning that is behind the rejection of God, because there is evil in the world. Let's define evil. All things considered, a genuine evil is an act or event whereby existence would be better had it not occurred. In other words, it is an evil that is not justified because it's not necessary to obtain a greater good. Let's sum up some of the traditional assumptions about God that arise in philosophical discussions concerning evil. God is good. Believers agree on that. God is all-powerful, omnipotent in the sense that He can do anything imaginable. Included in this is the idea that God created all things absolutely, out of nothing. God is also omniscient, including absolute foreknowledge of all the outcomes of His creative choices. I may have to part ways with these other assumptions. I'm not willing to invent strict dogmas concerning the nature and extent of God's omnipotence. Can God make a round square? Creation ex nihilo may very well be included as one of these logical impossibilities. God either cannot or will not do it. Likewise, I'm unwilling to make a doctrinal stand on the nature of God's omniscience. Does God know everything in the future because He stands outside time? Is it because of hyper-intelligent prediction? Or does He just know all possible outcomes? But let's forget about my views for now, and take these traditional assumptions and go over some of the historical philosophical criticisms. 18th century skeptic David Hume expressed the contradiction of these assumptions about God as follows. Why is there any misery at all in the world? Not by chance, surely. From some cause, then. Is it from the intention of the deity? But He is perfectly benevolent. Is it contrary to His intention? But He is almighty. Nothing can shake the solidity of this reasoning, so short, so clear, so decisive. English philosopher Anthony Flew put it this way. We cannot say that God would like to help but cannot. God is omnipotent. We cannot say that He would help if He only knew. God is omniscient. We cannot say that He is not responsible for the wickedness of others. God creates those others. Indeed, an omnipotent, omniscient God must be an accessory before and during the fact to every human misdeed, as well as being responsible for every non-moral defect in the universe. Now it's interesting that he says an accessory before and during the fact. He's saying that God is an accessory to murder and rape because God knew before he creates a creature that that person is going to murder and rape, an accessory before the fact, and during the fact because he doesn't step in and stop these heinous crimes. Even Christians have had to admit the reasoning to be had here. John Hick continues within the mindset and the doctrine of creation ex nihilo and understands the problem of evil given this theology. God's decision to create the existing universe was the primary and necessary precondition for the occurrence of evil, all other conditions being contingent upon this, and he took his decision in awareness of all that would flow from it. Not willing to reassess any of the traditional assumptions of God, Hick resolves the problem, and I have spoken to many Christians who also hold this view, by making yet another assumption, universal salvation. He writes, "We must thus affirm in faith that there will in the final accounting be no personal life that is unperfected and no suffering that has not eventually become a phase in the fulfillment of God's good purpose. Only so, I suggest, it is possible to believe both in the perfect goodness of God and in his unlimited capacity to perform his will. For if there are finally wasted lives and finally unredeemed sufferings, either God is not perfect in love or he is not sovereign in rule over his creation." This is fascinating to me because we find that in order to hold on to the unbiblical doctrine of ex nihilo creation, believers are adding to it another unbiblical doctrine, universal salvation. Another response to the problem of evil is known as the free will defense. It is described rather successfully in modern times by Alvin Plantinga. This defense describes that it is logically possible for God and evil to coexist as long as there is a strong notion of free will. I should mention that Plantinga said that even if God is omnipotent, there are nonetheless possible worlds he could not have actualized. So even with Plantinga, there is a notion that God is limited in some way, and serious problems remain with the free will defense. The first problem with the free will defense is that, based on your assumptions, you have to try and demonstrate that free will exists in the first place. You can review my first video for a deeper explanation of why true free will does not exist in the creation ex nihilo theology. I also address the issue in my video concerning the solitary problem. But allow me to suspend my disbelief for a moment and pretend that God can create us out of nothing and can grant free will. In my last presentation, I suggested that some spirits are morally good and others are morally bad. I gave the example of the spirit of the archangel Michael and the spirit of the fallen angel Lucifer. We can give other examples, such as Moses, John the Baptist, Isaiah, Mary. They're more on the good end of the spectrum here. And then on the bad end of the spectrum, we could mention Hitler, Stalin, Pol Pot, Vlad the Impaler, and so forth. Please note that I understand that all of the people mentioned here may be considered morally fallible, just that those on the right are more flawed than those on the left. The free will defense assumes that God must create morally fallible persons if he creates them free. But if God creates ex nihilo, then he can create any persons that is logically possible to create. God could have created people to be more sensitive, to be more rational, and in being more rational, they would make better decisions. Or you could say, God could have created free spirits that he knew would have ended up on the left end of the spectrum, on the good end of the spectrum. This would not violate the assumption that God can create any kind of spirit out of nothing and still have free will. But again, I must reiterate that I don't believe that assumption is correct. I don't believe that free will can exist if God creates ex nihilo. My point is that even if he could, even then the free will defense fails. It does not explain the world that we live in.